She painted to avoid starving to death, until her painting became the key piece of evidence in a crime. The cold October wind swept yellow leaves and the few passers-by down the streets of London. Alice wrapped herself in a worn-out coat, trying to shield at least her neck. She had sold her scarf the week before for £5. The wind crept in everywhere. Under the collar, into the sleeves, beneath the hem of her dress. She clenched her teeth to stop them from chattering and adjusted the easel, which threatened to topple with every gust. One more day, just one more day, she repeated to herself, rubbing her stiff fingers. On the sidewalk in front of her stood 3 paintings. 2 landscapes of the Thames in the misty morning light, and one, a gloomy, almost Gothic view of an abandoned mansion somewhere on the outskirts of the city. The latter she had painted the day before, in a fit of melancholy. Her father used to call such works black canvases, and always shook his head. People don't want to buy sadness, my daughter. They want sunshine, flowers, beautiful ladies in hats. But there had been no sunshine in her life for a long time. Not since he had passed away 6 months ago. Alice sighed and adjusted the price tag. £20. Too expensive, she knew. But she needed at least 10 for bread and tea. Passers-by hurried by, not even glancing. Young clerks in sharp suits, women with shopping bags, tourists with maps, none stopped. Only an old man in a tattered hat glanced at her work, muttered, "Too gloomy," and moved on. By midday, the rain intensified. Water seeped under her collar, turning her hair into wet strands. Alice was about to pack up when she noticed a man standing across the street. Tall, in a long black coat, he was unhurried, not seeking shelter from the rain. He just stood there, watching. Was he looking at her? At the paintings? She couldn't be sure. Then he crossed the street. "Are you an artist?" His voice was deep, emotionless. Alice nodded, suddenly aware of how she must look. Drenched, in an old dress, dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights. The man studied her paintings in silence. His face remained impassive, but when he reached the last one, the one with the mansion, his brows slightly furrowed. "Where is this place?" "Up north, in Hampstead. An abandoned house near the woods," Alice replied. She didn't mention that she had painted it from memory. Her father had once taken her there years ago to do studies. The man took out his wallet. "I'll take this one." He counted out £20, exactly what Alice had asked, without bargaining. When he handed her the money, his hand lingered for a moment, and she felt his gaze, assessing, almost predatory. "Do you visit this house often?" he asked. "No," Alice lied. He slowly nodded, took the painting, and left without a word. It was only when his figure disappeared into the fog that Alice realized he hadn't asked for her name. And he hadn't given his either. The rain lashed harder. She gathered the remaining paintings and hurried to her tiny flat in Soho. £20. That was for tea, bread, maybe even some cheese. And paints. She had to buy paints, the last tubes were running low. The door to her flat creaked open. The room was tiny. A bed, a table, an easel by the window. On the wall hung the only painting she hadn't sold, a portrait of her father, painted by him. "I sold another one, Dad," Alice whispered, clutching the money in her pocket. 2 days later, Alice stood in line at a small bakery near her house, counting the coins left from the £20. Bread, cheese, cheap tea. This time, she could afford a little more than usual. Outside, light rain was falling, turning the London streets into gleaming mirrors. Next, the baker called, and Alice stepped up to the counter. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to a stack of fresh newspapers tossed beside the cash register. The black and white photograph on the front page made her heart seize. Famous art collector found dead in abandoned mansion in Hampstead. Below the headline was a photo of the house. Her house. Alice reached out, grabbed the newspaper, and stared at the picture. Yes, it was definitely the same mansion, tall Gothic windows, peeling plaster, a half-destroyed turret on the right. The same one she had painted 3 days ago and sold to the man in the black coat. "Anything else, miss?" the baker asked impatiently. Alice silently placed the newspaper on the counter with the money. "And this too," she whispered. Her hands shook as she stepped outside. She unfolded the newspaper and began to read, leaning against the wet wall of the bakery. The body of Mr. Edgar Collingwood, a well-known collector of Victorian art, was found last night in an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of Hampstead. Preliminary reports suggest the cause of death was multiple stab wounds. Police are considering all possible leads. Alice closed her eyes. Stab wounds. The man. The buyer of her painting. He had asked if she ever went to that house. Oh God, what if he? She took a sharp breath and continued reading. The mansion, which had stood abandoned for many years, had recently been the site of suspicious activity, according to local residents. Alice folded the newspaper and almost ran home. Her tiny flat greeted her with cold and silence. She threw her groceries on the table and walked to the easel, where her unfinished painting stood, a study of London Bridge in the fog. What if there was something important in that painting? She tried to recall every detail. The mansion, the trees, the dark sky, nothing unusual. But why had that man bought that one? Alice grabbed a charcoal pencil and began sketching a painting from memory on a clean sheet of paper. The porch, the windows, the ivy. She was drawing quickly, almost in a trance. And then, her hand stopped. A shadow. Between the trees, to the left of the house. She didn't remember drawing it. But there, in her own sketch, a human figure clearly appeared. With something in its hands. A knife? Alice threw the pencil aside. An hour later, there was a knock at the door. Still trembling, Alice approached the door and cracked it open. Standing on the doorstep was a man in his mid-30s, wearing a dark coat, but he wasn't the one who had bought the painting. This man had hard gray eyes and a police badge in his outstretched hand. Detective Mark Harris, Scotland Yard. Miss Alice Morgan? She nodded, feeling her legs weaken. How can I help? He pulled a photograph from a folder and showed it to her. Do you recognize this place? The photo was of her drawing. The very same one. Yes, I drew it, and sold it 3 days ago to a man you didn't know? Alice nodded again. Detective Harris took a deep breath. Miss Morgan, you should come with me to the station. Why? Her voice wavered. He looked at her as if he already knew the answer to all her questions. Because, according to the experts, your drawing is the only thing linking the killer to the crime scene. But, how? You see, he pointed to the photograph. There's a detail here, in the corner, that shouldn't be there. Alice looked, and she saw it. The shadow. Only now, in the bright light, it was clear. It was a man. With a knife in his hand. And he was looking straight at the house. But I didn't draw this, she exclaimed. Detective Harris slowly shook his head. That's the problem, Miss Morgan. Because this man, he was there that night. And now we need to figure out how you knew. Alice felt the room spin before her eyes. The last thing she remembered before the darkness overtook her was Detective Harris' hands catching her as she fell. The office at Scotland Yard was surprisingly small and dreary. Alice sat on a hard wooden chair, gripping a paper cup of tea that had already gone cold. Across the table, Detective Harris methodically laid out photographs in front of her. Let's go over this again, Miss Morgan. You're claiming you didn't see this man at the house before you painted the picture? Yes, no. Alice ran a trembling hand across her face. I was just drawing from memory. A house from my childhood. Harris leaned back in his chair, studying her. His gray eyes seemed unsettlingly penetrating. Curious, because our expert says the position of the shadow matches the actual layout of the trees at the location. And that the outline of the person was painted over the already dried paint. Alice sharply raised her head. That's impossible. I worked alone in my apartment. Could someone have seen you? No, she hesitated, remembering the creaking floorboards by the door last week. Harris noticed her uncertainty. Miss Morgan, this man is a key witness in a murder case. Possibly the killer. And right now, you're looking like an accomplice? Alice sprang to her feet, knocking over the chair. I sell paintings on the street to buy bread. What possible reason could I have? The office door flew open. A tall man in a pristine suit appeared in the doorway. Mark, are you tormenting the girl instead of looking for the real criminal? Harris tensed. Sir, this is official. Official nonsense. The stranger walked up to Alice and extended his hand. Arthur Collingwood, nephew of the deceased. Alice instinctively shook his hand. His skin was surprisingly soft for a man's, like a collector's or a musician's hand. I'm very sorry for your loss. Arthur smiled sadly. Uncle was a complicated man, but he didn't deserve such an end. He turned to Harris. I brought something from his records. It might shed some light on things. Harris took the folder, but his gaze didn't leave Alice. You're free to go, Miss Morgan. But don't leave the city. It was drizzling outside. Alice, not noticing the drops on her face, walked through Trafalgar Square, trying to process what had happened. The silhouette over the paint. So, someone must have added it afterward. Her thoughts were interrupted by the honking of a car. A dark Bentley was parked by the curb, and Arthur Collingwood was peering out the window. Need a ride? You look soaked through. Alice wanted to refuse, but her feet carried her toward the car on their own. The warm interior smelled of leather and expensive tobacco. Thank you, she whispered. No need, Arthur replied, pulling out a silver flask. Cognac? She shook her head. You don't look like a grieving relative. Arthur laughed. And you don't look like a criminal. But here we both are. The car started moving. Why did you get involved back there? Because my uncle collected strange things. And he had dangerous acquaintances. Arthur looked at her thoughtfully. Like your buyer. Alice froze. You know who he is? Victor LeBlanc, an antique dealer, specializes in controversial acquisitions. A thief? A middleman. Arthur pulled out a business card. If you remember anything else, call me. He stopped the car outside her house. And Miss Morgan? Be careful. My uncle was looking into your father before his death. Alice stood frozen in the doorway. My father? She rushed to her room, to the only painting of his that remained. She took it off the wall, turned it over. On the back of the canvas, in the corner, was a barely visible inscription. Collingwood knows. Beware the blue envelope. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Alice held her breath. Miss Morgan? It's Harris. I need to speak with you urgently. A shadow flickered outside the window. The same one from the painting. The rain was tapping on the roof of the studio where Alice, in a panic, pressed her father's painting to her chest. The knock on the door came again, persistent, demanding. Miss Morgan, open up. It's Detective Harris. Her gaze shot to the window. Through the water-streaked glass, the silhouette of a tall man was clearly visible. Not the one who had bought the painting, but not alone. Coming, Alice shouted, quickly shoving the canvas under the couch. When she opened the door, Detective Mark Harris was standing there, soaked to the bone. Behind him stood a uniformed officer. Let us in, the detective didn't ask. He stepped over the threshold, scanning the tiny room with a professional gaze. His attention immediately went to the easel with an unfinished sketch. You're still painting, he remarked. After everything. Alice crossed her arms over her chest. I need to eat. Harris nodded to the officer, who began the search. The detective moved to the table where her sketches were lying. Why didn't you tell us that your father knew Collingwood? Alice's heart sank. I didn't know. That's a lie. He threw a photo on the table. Young Collingwood was standing next to her father at some exhibition. They were partners. Behind her, the officer lifted a couch cushion. Sir. Alice lunged forward, but Harris intercepted her. What are you hiding, Miss Morgan? She remained silent, watching as the officer pulled her father's painting out from under the cushion. Harris flipped the canvas over. Beware the blue envelope. What does that mean? At that moment, the sound of glass shattering filled the room. The window. Harris immediately drew his gun. Down. A bullet hit the lamp, showering them with shards. Alice fell to the floor, feeling someone's strong hand pressing her head down. Stay down, Harris yelled at the officer, then dashed toward the window. Outside, there was only the sound of rain and the creaking of swings on an empty playground. When he returned, Alice was already on her knees in front of the painting, her trembling fingers feeling the frame. Here, her voice cracked. It should be here. There was a snap of wood. Right in her hands, the frame cracked in half, and a yellowed envelope slipped out. Blue. Harris picked it up and tore the edge. A photograph and a key fell out. In the photo, her father, Collingwood, and LeBlanc, Alice whispered. The same man who bought my painting. Harris abruptly looked up. Where was this photo taken? Alice flipped the photo over. On the back, there was an address. Gallery, The Raven, Chelsea. The 9th of December 2005. The detective grabbed her hand. Get dressed. We're going. Why should I? Because, his voice grew dangerous, your father didn't die from illness. He was killed, just like Collingwood, and now the killer knows you found something. Alice looked at the broken window. Outside, in the shadow of a street lamp, there stood a figure in black. Watching. The London fog enveloped Harris's Bentley as they approached the gallery. Alice nervously fiddled with the blue envelope in her lap, gazing at the Art Deco building with the black silhouette of a raven above the entrance. Closed for renovation, read the sign. Harris smashed the door with his shoulder. Inside, it smelled of mold and turpentine. The flashlight beam highlighted dusty canvases covered with tarps. Alice froze in front of a large group portrait. There they were. Her father with brushes in hand, a young Collingwood, and a third man, whose face had been deliberately scratched out with a knife. It's him. LeBlanc, she whispered. Harris found a metal door with a lock. The key from the envelope fit perfectly. In the basement, they discovered a studio. On the easel was an unfinished portrait, Alice's face framed by bloody strokes. She swallowed a lump in her throat, recognizing her own style. Someone is forging my works. Harris opened a safe with documents. Among the papers was Collingwood's diary, with the note, "Deal with the Raven." On the yellowed page, "Today, Morgan learned the truth about the Blue Series. He'll have to be eliminated. LeBlanc guarantees the cleanup." Suddenly, the creak of floorboards echoed from above. Harris instantly turned off the flashlight, pressing Alice against the wall. Footsteps were getting closer to the hatch. Fleeing through the back exit, they arrived at a Victorian mansion on the outskirts. An elderly woman with piercing gray eyes, the same as Harris's, opened the door. "Mark, what happened?" "Mom, this is Alice Morgan, the daughter of that artist." The woman paled. In the sitting room overlooking the garden, she told them the story. "Your father uncovered a scam. They were forging paintings by deceased artists using blue envelopes with original sketches. When he refused to participate, Alice clenched her fists. Why did you stay silent for 15 years? Mark answered for his mother. Because my father was involved too. At that moment, the window glass shattered. A bottle with a smoldering wick swayed on the parquet floor. The explosion deafened Alice. She fell, feeling shards dig into her back. Through the smoke, she saw Harris shielding his mother with his body. Someone grabbed her hand. My father warned me about the blue envelope for a reason. Now they'll come for me. The dim light of a single lamp flickered in the damp basement, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Alice clenched her fists, feeling the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into her wrists. In front of her stood Victor LeBlanc, the same man who had bought her painting, now staring at her with a cold smile. You shouldn't have drawn him, he hissed, running his finger over her easel. This house, it belongs to me. Alice tried to move, but the ropes tying her to the chair wouldn't allow her to shift. I didn't know, she whispered. I just drew what I saw. Saw? LeBlanc laughed, but there was no humor in his eyes. You added something that wasn't there. He threw a newspaper in front of her with the headline. Murder at the Abandoned Mansion. Street artist's painting points to the killer. The photo was of her work, a grim landscape with a barely noticeable figure in the shadow. It's not me. Alice gasped in terror. I didn't draw that person. It doesn't matter. LeBlanc leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive whiskey and something metallic. You'll fix it. You'll draw a new version. Without the clues. He placed a blank canvas and brushes in front of her. Otherwise, he slowly ran his finger along her throat. You'll become the next victim in this house. Meanwhile, Mark Harris was frantically going through the evidence in his office. He knew Alice was missing. She wasn't in her shabby apartment, nor on the street where she usually sold her paintings. His fingers tightened around an old photograph. The murdered collector, his uncle, was standing next to Victor LeBlanc at some social event. Damn it, Mark slammed his fist on the table. He wasn't just working the case, he felt it. He felt that Alice was in danger. He felt that he couldn't lose her. His phone rang. Harris, he answered sharply. Mark, it's Mrs. Wilson from the gallery. A trembling voice came from the receiver. I found something. Your father's records. LeBlanc came here yesterday. He was looking for her. Mark was already reaching for his jacket when there was a knock at the door. On the threshold stood a tearful girl, the street vendor who often stood near Alice. She left this, the girl whispered, handing him a crumpled piece of paper. It was a sketch, careless, yet recognizable. An abandoned church on the outskirts. Where did she draw this? Mark grabbed the girl by the shoulders. A man took her. He said he would buy all her works. But she managed to slip this into my hand. Mark was already rushing to the car. He knew that place. Alice was trembling. The brush kept slipping from her fingers. She tried to paint a new version, without the figure in the shadows. But her hands betrayed her, adding details that weren't part of Leblanc's order. Are you doing this on purpose? He suddenly grabbed her by the hair. No, she squeezed her eyes shut. I can't control it. Leblanc growled and threw her aside. Then maybe you need some motivation? He pulled out a knife. At that moment, there was a crash from above. Leblanc froze. Who? The basement door burst open. Police. Hands up. Mark. Alice barely had time to see Leblanc dash toward the back exit before Mark was already there, his hands tearing the ropes apart. Are you okay? His voice trembled. She nodded, unable to speak. He escaped. No. Mark sharply lifted his head. Look. Alice turned. On the canvas she had been painting under the threat of a gun, amidst the trees and shadows, there were strokes forming an arrow, pointing to an old well in the yard. Did you know? Mark stared at her. No, she shook her head. But I felt it. Later, when Leblanc was caught, he had tried to retrieve a bundle of stolen paintings from the well. Mark stood next to Alice, watching as the morning sun illuminated the ruins of the mansion. You could have died, he whispered. But I didn't, she smiled faintly. He took her hand. Because I didn't let you. And for the first time in a long while, Alice felt that her life was not just a struggle for survival. The rain lashed against the roofs of London, turning the streets into black mirrors reflecting the rushing police cars. Victor Leblanc was fighting the officers, his fingers clenching into helpless fists as he screamed something in French. You don't understand. These paintings are mine. Mark Harris stood next to Alice, draping his jacket over her shoulders. His eyes never left the bundle the police had pulled from the well. Are these your father's works? He asked softly. Alice nodded. Her fingers trembled as she unrolled the canvas. Portrait in the shadows, she whispered. Dad painted it before he died. The painting depicted a man, not Leblanc, but the murdered collector. But in the mirror behind him, another person was reflected, holding a knife. Proof, said Mark. Your father knew they were up to something. Leblanc broke free for a moment, his eyes gleaming with madness. He stole them from me. All these paintings should have been mine. Shut him up, Mark said coldly, and the police roughly shoved Leblanc into the car. Alice watched as he was taken away, but instead of relief, she felt emptiness. Is it over? She asked. Mark turned to her. There was something new in his gaze. No, he said. This is just the beginning. Alice stood in front of a blank canvas in her new studio, small but bright, with large windows through which golden morning light poured. She hadn't painted since that day. The brush in her hand trembled. What if I can't do it anymore? There was a light knock at the door behind her. Come in, she said, not turning around. Mark stepped over the threshold, holding 2 cups of coffee. Still staring at the empty canvas? He asked, placing 1 cup next to her. I don't know where to start, Alice admitted. Start with the truth. She looked at him. And what's my truth? Mark smiled and pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, the same sketch of the abandoned church that had led him to her. Here it is. Alice took the paper, and suddenly her fingers stopped trembling. She turned to the canvas and made the first stroke. The Westwood gallery was packed. People in elegant outfits crowded in front of the paintings, whispering, nodding, admiring. On the central wall hung a piece titled, Truth in Paint, the same grim landscape with the mansion, but now it had no shadows. The sun illuminated the facade, and in the foreground stood 2 figures, a detective and an artist, their hands barely touching. Mark stood next to Alice, watching as an elderly woman approached her, his mother. Your father would be proud, Mrs. Harris said quietly. Alice smiled. I hope so. In the far corner, there was applause. It was the street vendors, her old friends. One of them raised a glass, though the security clearly disapproved. To Alice, the real artist. Mark chuckled softly and took her hand. So, Miss Artist, he said, do you know what your truth is now? She looked at her painting, then at him. Yes. And in that moment, She understood that her life wasn't just a series of coincidences. This was her story, and it was only just beginning.